The question is actually asking you if a tax authority has determined that you owe overdue taxes. In addition to all those other documents I've discussed, you also need to include a ton of evidence that you've been in a good faith marriage with your spouse and living together for the last few years. Hey guys, today we're going to be discussing some things that you must submit with your naturalization application. Otherwise, you might run into some problems down the road, or your naturalization application can even get denied. So we're going to be talking about two different situations. One is if you've been a permanent resident for 5 or more years. And the requirements in this situation are much easier. The second situation we're going to be discussing is if you've only been a permanent resident for 3 years and you've been married to your US citizen spouse during those entire 3 years. And that US citizen spouse is the person who initially petitioned for you to become a permanent resident. There is a provision in the immigration code that allows people who have been married to a US citizen and been permanent residents for 3 years to apply for naturalization, but for almost everybody else, it's 5 years. People who've been permanent residents for 5 or more years regularly ask me whether they need to submit their tax returns along with their naturalization application. And they often ask me how many years of taxes do I need to submit? And the answer is 0. You don't need to submit any years of taxes. The tax returns aren't necessary to be submitted with the application. Now, the application will ask you if you have filed a tax return every year since you've become a permanent resident, and it's a yes or no question. If the answer is no, you must explain why. For example, let's say you were a student or young and unemployed for some years when you had your green card, were a permanent resident. You would just explain, I wasn't working, or I was a full-time student during some of those years, so in these years, I didn't file a tax return. That's perfectly okay. If you answer yes, I've filed a tax return every year, you're usually just good to go. Another question that the application will ask you is if you owe any overdue taxes. Now, this is a little bit complicated. People will often say, well, I haven't paid my taxes yet for last year, or I haven't filed my most recent return yet, but they're still in the window where they could file for an extension, and they did file for an extension, they just haven't filed their final tax return yet. The question is actually asking you if a tax authority has determined that you owe overdue taxes. For example, the IRS says, you owe us this much money and you're overdue. If that's the case, what I recommend doing is contacting the IRS and getting a payment plan initiated before you apply for naturalization. And then I would submit evidence that you were granted a payment plan and that you're in compliance with the payment plan. That's what I would submit with the N-400, and then a few months later, when you end up going for your interview, the officer might ask you for updated evidence that you've been in compliance with your payment plan. This is pretty rare. I don't see it that frequently, but it definitely has happened before. Another document that some people need to submit is a certificate of disposition for any charge or crime that they've been arrested for, cited for, or been actually convicted of. And what I hear all the time is, oh no, I don't need to mention that because that was fully dismissed. Actually, you still need to submit a certificate of disposition saying that those charges were dismissed. That's exactly what they're asking for. And the N-400, the application for naturalization, will ask this in like 5 different ways. Have you ever been arrested, cited, detained, or charged, and like a million other things. They just want to know about pretty much every single police encounter. Another question I'll receive is, do I need to mention traffic infractions? And there's been some debate among the immigration attorney community about this. Some attorneys will say, no, that's not really a crime. It depends on the state. In some states, it might not be a real citation or a crime. Maybe there's an argument to be made. But my position is that USCIS is using the word citation to include even minor violations. So in an overabundance of caution, I will ask people to get a certificate of disposition for even minor traffic violations. And it can be kind of complicated because you can contact the court clerk where you paid the fee for that speeding ticket or whatever, and they might say, we don't have certificates of disposition. These are just minor violations. You only need a certificate of disposition for a crime. What I would ask is that clerk write a one-sentence letter saying, we've looked up the records for this person and there are no prior violations that exist in our record. Or we have these records, but there is no certificate of disposition. It was paid for and was resolved on this date. Basically, USCIS just wants to see what you were charged with and what the final outcome is, either with a certificate of disposition or, if none exists, just a letter from the court clerk saying that nothing exists. And it should typically be on original letterhead and have a signature of whoever is certifying that no records exist. Another question that I hear, and this is specifically for men who are permanent residents between the age of 18 and 26, is do I need to include a printout of my selective service registration? And what they are asking is, basically, if you go to the selective service website, there is a tool on that website where you can verify to see if you've ever registered. And actually on the N400 application, it will ask you for your selective service number if you were a man who was a permanent resident between the ages of 18 and 26. But you don't need to include anything else like a printout. And along those lines of printouts, you can look up your travel history. And in fact, the N400 will ask you for every time you've traveled, at least during the last 5 years. They just ask for the date you left the United States, the date you re-entered, whether that trip exceeded 6 months, 180 days, and what countries you visited during that trip. You don't need to print out evidence of it. You just need to fill out the chart on the N400 and be as accurate as possible. Now, there could be other documents that you would submit, especially if you answer yes to any of those long laundry list of yes or no questions that come towards the end of the application. For example, sometimes we will include evidence of military service in another country because it asks you. It's not always required. It depends on the immigration officer who's reviewing the application and exactly what you did. But there are two things that every applicant for the N400 needs to include. First of all, if you're submitting the paper version of the form, you need to include a check or money order for the correct filing fee, which, as of the filming of this video in December of 2023, is $725, made payable to US Department of Homeland Security. The other thing you definitely need to submit is a copy of the front and back of your green card. Now, let's say you're applying for your green card in less than 5 years because your US citizen spouse petitioned for you, you became a permanent resident, and you continue to live in a good faith marriage at the same residence as your US citizen spouse. You can actually apply theoretically earlier than the 5 years. Sometimes this is a little complicated if your I-751 petition to remove conditions is still pending. I've made a few videos on this, but let's say that you're gonna apply in the theoretical fastest time period after you've been a permanent resident for 3 years. So in addition to all those other documents I've discussed, you also need to include a ton of evidence that you've been in a good faith marriage with your spouse and living together for the last few years. So you should check out my videos on how to prove that you're in a good faith marriage. Documents can include evidence you've traveled together, evidence that you guys are both on the same lease, that you've bought property together, you bought a car together. If you have kids together, that's the best evidence. You would just include a copy of their birth certificates listing both parents. I'm not gonna go into all the evidence, but one thing is, in this situation, maybe you would submit a copy of your tax returns. If your tax returns were filed jointly and list your residential address, that's some evidence for the government to consider that you've been in a good faith marriage. I mean, you've been filing taxes jointly with this person, which also shows that you've been commingling your finances a little bit. Some of the evidence they really like to see is evidence of financial commingling, which in addition to joint tax returns can include joint bank accounts, joint credit cards, and things like that, joint retirement accounts, anything that is financial that you guys are sharing as spouses. All right, guys, so that brings us to the end of today's video. If you have any questions within a week or so of me posting the video, put it in the comments below. After about a week, when I post a new video, you would have to post any questions you have on my latest video, because I really, with my law practice, I don't have time to go and answer questions from a video I posted a year ago. If you are looking for an immigration attorney to assist you with the naturalization process, or you just have some questions, or even if you are prepared to submit the application by yourself and you want an attorney to just review it with you during a consultation, please feel free to schedule a consultation with me. We'll go through everything from start to finish during the hour consultation. You can book it directly through my website or by calling my office to schedule. All right, guys, that's it for today. I'll see you next week for another video.